how are you doing on the other side of the pond? How are things?
It's good. I mean, I'm feeling very pumped and very fired up after the day at GFN. I mean, some of my favorite people have been performing out of their skins, basically, telling it as it is, telling it as they see it. I completely loved Louise Ross's Michael Russell oration. That was just a highlight for me. Absolutely brilliant. But the whole thing has been really, really inspiring. I chaired questions and answers earlier, and it was really, really good in my view. The questions that were coming up, really thoughtful, the kind of discussion you really want to have at a conference like this. Normally we'd be retiring to the bar around now, but I guess that's something we'll just have to wait for another year or so to do next time. But yeah, great conference, great discussion. I hope everybody tunes in for tomorrow, because there's another fantastic lineup tomorrow.
Yes, it really was amazing, and I have to admit, I am very disappointed that we are not able to, have a couple of pints to be able to discuss this. But I'm glad that we get to have a conversation here with everybody on our broadcast. Right off the bat, I would love to, I do want to get into some of the things that you did talk about, both in the question and answer in your own panel. But, you in particular have a very diverse background. You've worked for a lot of different companies in a lot of different sectors. So I would love if you can just give our audience a quick overview of, sort of how you ended up as a part, such a vocal part of this tobacco harm reduction fight across the globe.
Well, I started life in the corporate sector. I worked for IBM for many years. Then I took a change of direction, did a master's in environmental policy, worked for Greenpeace for a while, and then in Central Eastern Europe. After that, I joined, it was difficult to progress in the environment movement. So there's a lot of people crowding in, and there was, it was difficult to move on. So I jumped sector, worked in public health. So I moved to Action on Smoking and Health, 1997, where I was the director. Had just the most amazing time there running small organization. After that, actually, I made a move into government. So I went and worked in Tony Blair's strategy unit in the Cabinet Office in the British government. I worked for an environmental regulator, the UN in Sudan, the Department of Energy and Climate Change. And then I came back. I decided I would work as a consultant, freelance, enabled me to travel more freely. I work in sort of now, my wife is a diplomat, so work in different countries, currently live in Nigeria most of the time. And so I've now got the flexibility of being a consultant in sustainability and public health. I don't, I avoid conflicts of interest with respect to the tobacco and vaping industry, but I live a pretty free and flexible life, and it's good. It's very rewarding. I'm considering the harm reduction agenda as like unfinished business from when I was at ASH. I campaigned a lot at the time to have people quite surprised by this, but to have the ban on snus lifted, which I, really as soon as I understood anything about the tobacco issue, I immediately understood how ridiculous that was. And obviously that's been an utter failure. Since we first started raising it in 1998, it's still well and truly banned. But who knows? Maybe in the end, reason and rationality and actual concern for health will win the day, and the EU will lift that stupid ban. And if the EU doesn't, well, maybe the UK will use its freedoms under Brexit to do exactly that. I hope they do.
Yes, it is certainly, interesting, heartbreaking to see how, and I would love to, just get your thoughts on this. We discussed on our broadcast not last week, but the week before that, with Dr. David Abrams and Julie Wosner and Dr. Raymond Ayura about how, the idea of harm reduction in many other areas seems to, at least the WHO, other health organizations, seems to really embrace that idea, or at least they do now. When it comes to harm reduction in the world of tobacco, you see things like snus, you see these alternative nicotine products. What do you think the block is? Why has this not been embraced as much as other proven harm reduction methods?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a no-brainer in drugs, in sexual health, in many areas of public health. We don't assume that we can make people stop whatever it is behavior that we somehow disapprove of as a society or think is wrong, but that we can do things that will reduce the harm to them. And it's just absolutely obvious. In tobacco control, I think they have always, first of all, I think there's an industry involved. So they see the tobacco industry and essentially attribute the problem to the tobacco industry. And therefore, that any sort of equivocation on that is somehow a concession to the tobacco industry. It's simply not the case. The use of cannabis or opioids, the issues of prostitution and sexual health issues. These things are all hardwired in society. There's not a commercial actor pushing them along. They're much more subtle and complicated problems. And smoking and nicotine use is the same. It's not generated by an industry, and it's not a concession to an industry to reduce the harm caused by it, as if that's somehow a bad thing to do. The other thing I think, and this is a really nasty side of this debate, is that the harm is in effect, it's part of the package of pain that's designed to make you stop doing the habit that society sort of disapproves of. So you have this question, well, what if there were no harms at all with smoking or vaping? What if it was completely benign? Would the opposition to it actually just go away? And the answer is no, really, because the opposition is due to a sort of more fundamental kind of almost disgust about the way people are, not doing what they should, they're not behaving in the way that we would think. There's also a very strong class and minority-based dimension to this that you don't see with alcohol, for instance. So, many people who campaign vociferously against nicotine are quite enthusiastic alcohol users, and I've often joked with basically friends in the tobacco control world who are saying, well, in the end, we should try and stop people using nicotine altogether. And we're both there drinking a nice glass of red wine. They say, well, do you think we should stop all use of this particular drug in this particular circumstances? And I think there's a kind of, drugs of the poor sort of snobbery here about it, in which this is something they let themselves down with. And the harms, the cancer, the heart disease, or anything, something that they kind of have coming to them, and they ought to stop to get rid of those things. And I think the whole tobacco control agenda is quite interesting when you think about it, is we will inflict pain on you. We will put taxes on you. We'll put restrictions on you. We will stigmatize or denormalize you. We will, we will clear away the places that you go to. Socialize. We won't let you socialize in those places doing these behaviors. And the deal is the pain will stop when you give up the habit that we don't like. And I think that model, that quite coercive model, is quite deeply rooted in tobacco control. It's quite difficult to give up in favor of a harm reduction model in which you go with the flow of what people want. Consumers choosing to use low-risk products in a lightly regulated market provided by private sector entities is not part of that playbook. It's very countercultural.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and the fact that you talk about the stigma that is attached to that as well. we discussed that. There was a research that came out of UCLA, last year that was talking about the stereotype threat and how, that really just does reinforce it, especially with those people that smoke. So when it comes to, that in particular, that stigma and sort of trying to change that conversation, what in your opinion do you think is the best way for consumers, those that use these products, or even somebody that's watching that might not use the products, but they have their mom or their dad or their brother who smokes combustible tobacco? What do you think the best way to try to change that conversation is?
Well, I think the most important thing is first of all to understand what's a problem and what's not. The real problem and the real reason people went into this business, in my case, was that I don't like cancer. I don't like the fact that people live with emphysema, drop dead with heart attacks. I think that's the issue, and that's what we're trying to stop. There's a lot wrong. There's a lot of harm caused by smoking, but the harm is caused by the smoke and not by the nicotine that people choose to use, or in some cases are dependent to. So I would be understanding about that. I think that I've never used nicotine myself, so I don't have direct experience of this. But people like it, depending on how you want to frame it. They like it, or they're dependent on it, or it's an important part of what they do. So go with that. If you've got something that says, well, you can carry on more or less doing what you like doing, you obviously, most people don't want to die of cancer, have a heart attack, or be unable to breathe. So let's see if we can fix that. Let's move to a situation where at least you're using nicotine in a way that doesn't do all this harm. And if you want to move on from that point and give up nicotine altogether, that's your call. You'll find it easier, but at least in the meantime, we'll have dealt with the stuff that's causing really nasty diseases. And if you want a masterclass in how to think about that, then I suggest people watch Louise Ross's Michael Russell oration today, because the key ingredients in that are empathy, humility. They are about insights into how people feel about this. They're about pragmatism, not ideology or idealism. They're about fixing concrete problems for people in a way that works for them. And above all, they're about results. This isn't just some woolly kind of, well, let's all have a group hug. Louise Ross and her approach, they get results. They get results because they go with the grain of what the people who they're working with want. They're going with, they're pushing at an open door rather than trying to batter it down with taxes, stigma, restrictions, and kind of spiteful attitudes. And that's why I think they're successful. And that's why the products work. It's not just that they're effective as alternatives to smoking, it's that people want to use them. And the effect in public health terms is a product of how effective they are at displacing smoking, multiplied by the number of people who actually want to go down that route. So you can have these fantastic central nervous system drugs, but if nobody wants to use them because they make them feel weird, then great, you've got an effective product that no one wants, which means it's ineffective.
Exactly. So you mentioned some concrete things, and I would love to be able to speak to a couple of, you gave a wonderful presentation today where you were talking about sort of what's wrong, and one of the things that you said in there was that there has been a structural change in media, right? So yeah. Social media and things that shifted from the financial crisis. We obviously here at VIDA News, we are a media organization. Speaking directly to us and others that may be like us, what do you think that organizations like us can do to help move that in the right direction?
Well,
not to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's difficult because we went from a situation where there were a few newspapers and television channels available to everybody. We more or less watched the same thing, and the content was curated by people who didn't feel especially strong sense of competition, or certainly not at the article level. They were competing at the channel level or at the newspaper title level. And now what you have is a massive cacophony of sources crowding everybody out, and then basically the user is choosing the content they want, unfortunately, usually according to their priors, their preconceived notions, often looking for reinforcement rather than challenge, and often I think just hoping to find even more extreme versions of their own position to consolidate their own world view. And of course, hate-fueled nonsense that you want. So my advice, I think, to media organizations is, first of all, keep it brief, because the attention span is way down. I'm not always the best at that, I realize that. Keep it brief because the attention spans are right down, but also try to get opposing views. Try to foster the discussion and the debate in a respectful and interesting way. And then maybe there'll be a market for people who want to see both sides pitted against each other, or both sides interrogated. Even if that's not face to face, maybe you just interrogate in a more challenging way each of the views that, views from different sides of the spectrum, and then people can make up their own minds. I would like to think that there'll be a growing market for well-edited and curated debate as people realize that the kind of ultra-polarized echo chambers are actually not really worth very much, and they're kind of reservoirs of stupid rather than, kind of pools of insight.
Yes, I think that's a wonderful point, and it's one that Dr. Glover actually was talking about during the Q&A that you hosted earlier, where she was mentioning that it's not necessarily always just about that common ground, but it's about finding that healthy debate and actually having that type of discussion, because that's that is where innovation does happen. So do you have any and obviously we were just discussing media companies, but more for even individuals, like what are your thoughts on the best way to be able to sort of bring more people to that table with opposing views? Because it seems now that a lot of people are just very much set in their ways, and they believe either prohibitionist or harm reduction. What do you see as a way to sort of bring those people together?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about this, because I'm very impatient with the arguments from the other side, which I mostly look at that not through a lens of what professionalism looks like in public health. And there are other people, my good friend Joe Gitchell, for example, who are very kind of open-minded about discussions with anybody on any basis, whereas I have a bit more of a view that if you're in this business and you're paid money, you have a professional obligation to be realistic about the science, to understand the people you're dealing with, not to engage in kind of hate campaigns, abuse and bullying, to be open-minded. And I'm afraid I see rather too little of that. But having said that, I would say that if you can find the space for conversations in private, respectful discussions, if you can get to know people, break through the kind of sense that smokers and vapors are other, to be despised, to be marginalized, to be stigmatized, you can actually talk and understand where they're coming from, then you can make a lot of progress. I think one of the things I always say to academics and activists in this field is you think you're in this business and you've got all the answers. That's not true. Okay, you're very certain about the youth vaping epidemic, about banning flavors, about nicotine limits, about prohibitions. You are way, way too comfortable with your certainties and your priors. And what you should have, because you're dealing with actual human life here, actually people getting cancer, actually people dying in misery, you should have a duty of curiosity. And I've said this many times, so apologies if people have heard this, but David Sweena opened the conference by reminding everybody that we have seen the cigarette consumption in Japan fall by around a third in just over 2 years. Now, you in the public health field should be curious about that. You should be asking, how on earth did they do that when we've totally failed to do anything equivalent anywhere in the world ever, except in war or, you know, natural disaster? And you should be on a plane, landing in Tokyo, trying to find out. You should be trying to understand. You should be, when you finished in Tokyo, you should be getting on a plane and flying to Stockholm. Why the cooking price is only 7% and cancer and heart disease is anomalously low amongst the male population, because that is the proof of concept for harm reduction. You should be talking to vapors, and there are, if you look on the CASAR website, the American Consumers Organization website, you'll see well over 10,000 individual testimonials. You shouldn't dismiss those as like, oh, it's an anecdote, it's not science. When you have 10,000 people telling you something, you should listen. You shouldn't go, well, they're just users, what do they know? They haven't run a randomized controlled trial, which, by the way, are unsuited to measuring a phenomenon like vaping. You should be curious about it, and you should be down there trying to understand. You should be spending a day in a vape shop, talking to the owner, and maybe, if you can, chatting to the customers. Not sticking a probe into them or, you know, trying to measure the air quality, but trying to understand what they actually think. I would consider that to be good public health professional conduct. On my side, I think we should understand where they're coming from. We should understand what they're fearful about, what it is about young people. I can't be too sympathetic because I don't agree with them and I don't believe any of their arguments. But we should be able to engage on the subject of young people, okay? Now, the situation is much more nuanced than the headline figures would have you believe. It's a much more subtle problem. The causes of youth vaping are more subtle, and where vaping fits in the landscape of young people's problems is also not what you get from the narrative about it. So that's some of the ideas I think I have on that area.
Those are fantastic ideas. I do want to remind everybody that if you do have any questions for Clive, to please make sure to drop them in the comments below. If we're unable to get to them here, we'll make sure to tweet them at Clive, and I'm sure he'll be able to give us any answers there. I do want to ask you one more question, because I do feel like you are very well equipped to be able to answer this. In the Q&A, there was some discussion around the WHO. And, we see that increasingly there is less and less public and governmental funding for the organization, and more, individual or philanthropic organizations that are using the WHO to essentially be able to push their own agendas around the world. The news very recently, obviously for other reasons, but the United States has decided that they are going to withdraw funding. Do you think that we're coming to a point where the public may actually lose faith in the WHO as a sort of as an entity that can not just have these personal agendas? Is there a vacuum that's being created for Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Gates Foundation to be able to step in?
Well, first of all, WHO, I have some sympathy for WHO. Their problems really are quite profound. The member states should step up to the plate, fund the organization properly, ensure it's properly managed, and that it does the right things. The number one right thing it should do is to prepare for transnational infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics. If that's not obvious now, it was obvious before, but if it's not obvious now, someone's missing the point. That is clearly the mandate that it should be able to do. And these things are terrifying And we're getting off lightly, believe it or not, with this pandemic. There's potentially much worse to come, and the readiness for that is really important. I remember the early days of the WHO's work on tobacco, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and the idea there was to basically help governments make good policy on tobacco by creating norms. Now, what they've strayed away from that, and they've become like a campaigning organization now, not just generalizing good sound practice, helping countries do that. They've moved into a much more assertive campaigning role, and that is partly because they are funded from private contributions from the likes of Gates, Bloomberg, Vital Strategies, one or two others, where money is in WHO. I don't think it's just the money. I think ideologically that's where they have drifted. And that is very dangerous territory for them to get into. I'm not in the camp that says abolish the WHO. If we abolished it, we'd have to reinvent it again. It has some valuable, important functions. It just needs to work properly. It needs a modest approach to tobacco, which is focused on credible information sharing, policy support, economic analysis, and so on, that helps people make good policy, particularly in developing countries. It does not need to be an ideological zealot marching around trying to drag developing countries into bad policies. We clearly need an entity that deals with pandemics and major infectious diseases. That needs to be reset and restarted again with top quality science, early warning systems, and all the rest of it. So there is a future for WHO, but the member states have to step up to the plate, fund it properly, drive out the voluntary contributions. That's a ridiculous way to fund an international organization, and get it a clear mission, a limited mission, get it back on track, stop it producing rubbish science and rubbish analysis. That's the responsibility of the shareholders of WHO, the executive board, and the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. They need to get a grip on it, and they need to do that quickly.
Wonderful. Clive, that is all that we have for you right now. I want to make sure to honor your time. I really do hope that this is the first time we've had you on the program. I certainly hope it is not the last. I've personally had many people say, "Oh, you definitely need to make sure to have Clive on." So I'm incredibly gracious for your time. And do you have any specific parting thoughts for our audience today?
I think if you're in public health and you're in tobacco harm reduction and you're in this field, there's an almighty struggle, okay? And it can feel very depressing at times. The other side seems to have unlimited money, unlimited almost capacity for mendacity. It seems to be incredibly influential. But my belief is that we will prevail, and we'll prevail because the underlying cause is right, the underlying market dynamic is right, because people don't want to die of cancer and heart disease, because there's people like Louise Ross who are in the game, who understand this from the bottom up, and that's how it will work. It'll work from the bottom up because people just want this. No one wants the cancer, no one wants the heart disease, but people do want alternatives, and they do want to be left alone to look after themselves at their own initiative and at their own expense. And if we keep that in mind, then ultimately we'll prevail.
Fantastic. Clive Bates, Director of the Counterfactual, thank you so much for joining us today.